Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I would send some special thanks to Harry for coming over to Ghent today to talk with our students and give them a little presentation about front-end architecture. I think in the beginning of this year, we had a few brainstorm sessions with students from Open Summer Code 2014 and before that about what we could do to improve the concept of Summer of Code. And a few students proposed lots of names for speakers that they wanted to hear about because they were so enlightened by what they said. Among those people were very big names like Tim Berners-Lee, and a few big names like Harry Roberts. Tim Berners-Lee didn't let us know anything, which is too bad. But Harry was like, "This seems like a great project. Maybe I should come to Ghent." And we emailed a bit, and here he is. So that's cool. We invited our students as well as some people from Deep Bodies, as well as some people from the Startup Garage, because we're still open Summer of Go. We want to be open about what we do. We also have a live stream. I don't know if the quality or the stability of the network will suffice, but we're recording this anyway, so we can put it online if necessary. But the best way to listen to this guy and to ask questions is just to do it live. So thank you for coming. And that's what I'm going to say so far. So thank you, Harry, and you can just take over.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for inviting me over. As soon as I heard about Open Summer of Code, I was like, this sounds amazing, because we don't really have things like this in England. Certainly part of England I'm from, which is something I should mention. I don't have a regular English accent. I've got a weird Northern English accent. So I say code, where most people would normally say code. So if I say anything weird that doesn't make sense, just stick your hand up into it. It's surprising that I do so much public speaking, considering I've got such a weird accent. But yeah, I was real happy to come over. Unfortunately, I can't stay very long. I have to leave almost straight after the talk, unfortunately. But just seeing what you've been working on in the last couple of hours has been really inspiring. I don't really use the word inspiring or inspirational very lightly, but seeing what students are building, the impact it could have for the lives of just regular people in Belgium is absolutely fantastic. So yeah, it's a real privilege for me to be here. Yeah, the talk is an introduction to front-end architecture. It's going to be quite a philosophical talk. We will look at some specific things to do with front-end architecture, but for the most part, it's going to be fairly philosophical, yeah, sort of the roles and responsibilities of a front-end architect, where they might fit within a business, the kind of ways you could transition towards that kind of role. So quick show of hands, who would consider themselves a front-end developer? Wow, not many of you. Okay, wrong audience. Okay, no, what we'll actually learn is that front-end architecture is about the entire business. So it could be from the user right through to UX, through to software engineering. A front-end architect basically facilitates and enables other people to work more effectively. I want to specifically say hello to Ghent, because this is my second time here. I came here to work with a client back in March, and I absolutely fell in love with Ghent. We've got a city in England called York. I don't know if you've heard of York, but it's in the north, near where I live. And it's a real historic, very handsome, very pretty, like very good-looking city. And Ghent is like 10 times better. And also, Belgium, best beer in the world, and that's a fact. So yeah, the eating and the drinking in Ghent is amazing. The tech scene seems really good. So yeah, I'm absolutely thrilled to be in Ghent, and it is just a real shame I can't spend much more time hanging around with you guys. So yeah, my name's Harry. I'm a consultant front-end architect. We'll get onto the consultancy bit in a second. I specifically do consultancy work Front-end architecture doesn't have to, you don't have to be self-employed, you don't have to be a consultant whatsoever. We'll just cover what my kind of role is as a consultant in a second. I write and tweet and share things about front-end architecture, performance, the design process at CSS Wizardry. CSS Wizardry is a horrible, horrendous, stupid name I picked when I was 17 years old, and it's kind of stuck with me now. But if you have any questions at all, you can find me anywhere online as that, GitHub, Twitter, etc. Please ask me as many questions as you might want. I really enjoy kind of outreach. The last thing on this slide, specifically for this talk, we've got a hashtag because everybody loves a hashtag. FEA intro. Basically, that exists purely to start conversation immediately. If you have any disagreements with anything I've said, any differences in opinion, any stories of your own from the work you're doing, if you fire a tweet out with the hashtag, we can all just see what everybody's thoughts are. We can start answering questions in real time in the room. You don't have to use it, but if you are wanting to discuss or disagree with anything or ask any questions via Twitter, just stick under that hashtag. So yeah, a really quick bit about what I do then. So being a consultant means I go into a lot of companies and help them assess and fix their UI problems. It could be scaling the site itself. It could be scaling the team that's working on that site. It could be performance implications. And doing that in a consultancy kind of role means that I spend a lot of time with a lot of different clients, hearing a lot of different problems. So I'm basically a shoulder to cry on. I'm like a therapist for developers. And I tend to work typically with larger companies, not necessarily 100% of the time, but typically a front-end architect would work in a larger company purely because larger companies have a bit more money, they can afford specialists. So if you want to specialize in anything, my general advice would be look to go somewhere quite large. Working with these kind of companies allows me to specialize so heavily that pretty much all I deal with is the design process and CSS. So I'm actually more of a CSS architect than a front-end architect because I don't write any real-world JavaScript.
What's a large company to you?
A large company would be any of these kind of people. So these are, I'm not doing this to show off either, but large companies, we've got like the United Nations there, we've got people like Google. So I've done work with people like this. But large could be like super big, like Google size. But large is basically any company that's big enough to start hitting problems with multiple developers contributing to a code base. So the reason I have this slide is, I was going to say, these are the kind of people I typically work with. But who's familiar with these guys? Wes? So when I was in Ghent last time, it was with these guys. And they're not a traditional big company. Like they're not hundreds and thousands of employees. But they're big enough to start hitting the kind of problems where they've got engineers who have to, or developers and designers who have to contribute, maybe 10 people on one project, or they move around lots of different projects at different times. So for me, a large company traditionally would mean someone like Facebook, Google, that kind of thing. But someone like Wiz hits the kind of problems that Google would hit, just on a kind of slightly smaller scale. You can do front-end architecture in any size company though. If you are a small startup of 3 people, and one of you is a front-end dev, your front-end dev role will actually become a more architectural one, so you have to make decisions about frameworks and tooling. So yeah, large is very subjective, but anyone who isn't familiar with Wiz needs to be, because I think they're an amazing company. The team's really, really nice. They're such nice people. But I also think they're a really good example of modern front-end development. I think they stand as a good example and a beacon of good development practice. Lots of prototyping, designing in the browser, good knowledge and use of tooling, and they're right here in Ghent, so fantastic company. I would consider them a fairly large agency. I think they must have about 60 employees now, I guess. Anyone fact check that? Be around 60? 62. Yeah, 62 specifically, good knowledge. So anyway, what that means is I don't actually build websites. I haven't actually built a website for any of these clients. What I do is I go in and help them build the websites. The front-end architect role is more about knowledge sharing, tooling, process, and enabling other developers to do the work. So let's take a look in some fairly, some much more detail about what front-end architecture actually is. Also, yeah, please do shout out any questions. We're a nice small room today, so we don't have to wait till the end to answer questions. If you've got a question, just throw your hand up. So yeah, a front-end architect, a much more strategic role. You'd have to start thinking about things in terms of months to years. So instead of thinking, how do we build this nav, you would have to start asking questions about how do we scale this platform for the next 5 years? How do we introduce new developers onto this project whilst keeping a good velocity? So a lot of the work happens quite internally. A lot of the work that a front-end architect does never really gets noticed by a user, which is kind of upsetting, but what it means is you work kind of a layer behind your front-end developers. If you imagine your front-end developers are people, on the front line fighting the war, or fighting the battle, sorry, your front-end architects and architects in general, so it could be platform, it could be solutions architects, they're a much more strategic role behind the people on the front line. And what this means is it's really cool and you get to span lots of different roles and responsibilities. You'll actually get to dip your toe into much, much more than you might do having a very specific role, which is kind of a bit contradictory. I said you specialize a lot when you become a front-end architect, but what you end up doing is that specialism is, like, kind of by default, helping other people understand UI problems. And front-end architecture is a job title that I actually invented to give to myself. And I didn't do this just kind of to be pretentious. I was working at a company in 2012. You can actually see, this is where I actually, well, you can't see. 1st of May 2012, I wrote a post on Google+, just kind of thinking out loud. Anyone remember Google+? Familiar with that? And basically, I got to a point as a front-end developer where I realized that my role wasn't really about building websites anymore. It was about helping teams to build websites. So I just wrote this kind of off the top of my head, thinking out loud, and I kind of suggested, well, when you get to a certain point in certain companies, you end up adopting a more strategic role anyway. And there isn't really a name for that in UI kind of land. So I came up with the term front-end architect when I was working for this company, Sky. Has anyone heard of Sky? It's a very British company. It's a very large multimedia organization. Employs a lot of people, I think 30,000 people. The office I was working in had around 500. I was a senior UI developer there for quite a few years, but I was vastly outnumbered. I was the only front-end dev in a team of maybe 100 engineers. We're talking test engineers through to, like, software engineering, platform engineering. What this meant was my work wasn't scalable at all. It doesn't matter how good you are, one person cannot keep up with the work of 100 other people. It's just not going to happen. So I hit a real bottleneck. My work just wasn't scalable. I was trying to do the UI work to match the work of dozens and dozens of software engineers, programmers, web developers. So I needed to try and come up with a bit of a solution to this. My solution wasn't, work twice as long. That's not a scalable solution either. I had to work smarter. And what working smarter meant was basically just getting other people to do my work for me. So I started to build things like frameworks, UI toolkits, internal tools, fixing up the tool chain so that other people could implement UI stuff very safely without needing me to break off what I was doing and do it for them. So we don't just build the product, we actually build the things that build the product. At Sky, this took the shape of something called Aluminium. Aluminium was our internal bootstrap, if you like. A lot of people say bootstrap is a CSS framework, which isn't strictly true. A framework is much more philosophical and conceptual. So bootstrap would be a UI toolkit. Aluminium was our version of that. That in turn was built on top of Inuit CSS, and Inuit CSS is a CSS framework. It's designed around scalability and performance. So these are architectural decisions that I just kind of made in my day-to-day job as a front-end dev. I was thinking, right, we need a UI toolkit. I don't want to build the same buttons 15 times. We'll build a UI toolkit. What ended up happening here was I had to then teach other people how to use it. It was all well and good me using it, but the whole point of it was that we could get software engineers to contribute to UI development. We can get designers prototyping with actual branded bits of UI. So we started running internal workshops and talks. You come up with something quite cool. You might have a 2-hour workshop or a 2-hour kind of session on naming conventions or CSS architectures. This all gives others the ability. So a front-end architect is an enabler. You would do UI stuff that doesn't build the product directly. You then hand it off to other people so they can work and match your kind of pace, contributing in the way you want them to. So yeah, design and build systems and tools, strive for consistency. We want to make sure that if anyone has to dip in and out of different projects, they can pick up where you left off very easily. Keeps productivity high. And we don't care much about implementation. A question I always get from clients is, Should we use grid layout or flexbox? And my answer is, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Anything inside the curly braces is implementation detail. That won't affect how scalable your product is. So a front-end architect would typically only care about the things outside of the curly braces. How does this interact? How can we deploy this? How can we scale this architecture for the next 5 to 7 years? Really valid question I get asked quite a lot is, why do we even need one? Front-end development's relatively simple. So why do we actually need someone in charge of it? Why do we need front-end architects? Before I answer it, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. I was working with a client in London about 3 weeks ago, and they were a fascinating client. They were doing a lot of data manipulation, a lot of proprietary stuff, but they had really, really, really talented developers. There was one guy there who was actually a particle physicist. He was a doctor of particle physics who graduated at CERN, as in CERN who invented the World Wide Web. So obviously I was well out of my depth. And this guy at CERN, he did a lot of data manipulation, decided to move towards software engineering and computer science rather than particle physics. So this is a guy who's used to everything being quite difficult. You know, particle physics isn't particularly simple. So when he moved into software engineering, he knew about paradigms like object orientation or functional programming or this kind of stuff. And what I realized speaking to him was, he's always known development to be hard. He's always known these paradigms as a software engineer. And no one's really explained to him that front-end development got difficult too. There was a point where front-end development used to be really, really, really simple. Float left, color red. We just mark up simple HTML pages. Think about the web 10 years ago. Front-end development was dead simple. But software engineering has always been hard. So that's how I explained it to him. So look, think about the browser landscape, now the device landscape, think about performance and connectivity issues. We've got responsive design. We've got all these different things that are making front-end dev much more complex. Sites are getting bigger. Users' expectations are getting higher and higher. We're having to meet those. So we need someone like a front-end architect to actually stay on top of this and create strategies, solutions, tool chains, frameworks, etc., to service this brand new demand in UI development. So yeah, we've had a huge emergence in tooling, huge emergence in a lot of things, which I think is fantastic news because it's putting front-end development on the map. It's actually giving us a kind of a reason to exist. A lot of companies you work at, you'll probably find that everybody contributes to CSS. Designers will write CSS, programmers will write CSS, because CSS it's easy. But looking after it at kind of Facebook scale or government scale, it's really difficult. So it's important to have someone who can provide that level of knowledge. That would be your front-end architect. That role in a business completely depends on the organization itself. So who would actually be a front-end architect? I don't have a very good answer. It all completely depends on where you're at. If you're lucky enough to find yourself in a fairly large organization, they might have the budget and therefore the space for a dedicated front-end architect. That's going to be quite rare. The very few companies I've worked at, they actually have this dedicated role. I worked for Kickstarter last year, and they actually have someone who's a CSS architect. It's literally all her job is, and it's just her job to be amazing at sort of design process and UI development just in CSS. But Kickstarter are a very wealthy company. They're going to be the exception to the rule. So in a smaller company, perhaps an agency, someone like Vase, it might be a lead developer, someone who's got the knowledge of strategy and architecture might adopt that front-end architecture position. It might not be an official job title, but it might land on their shoulders. But you can also do what I did and literally just invent it for yourself. If you notice a gap in your company, you notice that the way we write CSS is absolutely horrendous, or we should be making use of JavaScript micro libraries. Take that responsibility on yourself and become the front-end architect. That's exactly what I did at Sky, and then it's become my full-time job because of that. So a huge bit of advice for anyone who's starting out in the industry is carve your own niche. Right? Find something you really want to do, get really good at doing it, and then make sure everybody knows how good you are. Vocalize that inside the business, make sure the rest of the company know that if they need help setting up a set of bulk tasks, that you're the person to speak to. So yeah, if you want to be it, just do it, get on with it, start right now. Start getting involved sooner. So we were having conversations earlier about the actual role of front-end developers in most companies. And who's actually worked in an agency? So oftentimes what will happen in an agency, in a not particularly good agency, you will get the creative director and a project manager go to meet a client. They'll sell the client all the features they want. The designers then will design it, and then the developer will be handed a PSD and told, you've got 2 weeks to build it. And that's terrifying. That's happened to me way too many times in my career. So as a front-end architect, because of this new strategic role, you need to start inviting yourself to client meetings. If you want to be able to help scale a platform, you need to understand the intricacies of why it even needs to exist. So rather than just building designs, we need to take a much more high-level approach. Another really good thing you could do if you want to start carving this niche out for yourself is find out what your colleagues struggle with. Shadow and pair with other developers, find out what they find difficult. They might not understand how to lay things out effectively in a responsive build. By shadowing and pairing with other developers, you can learn lots and lots about inefficiencies and just start fixing those. Who's familiar with the job title DevOps? DevOps, or developer operations, is basically a hybrid role between platform engineering, server administration, that kind of stuff, and software engineering. So a DevOps person might sort out build processes or continuous integration environments. They might deploy and manage development environments or production environments. So DevOps exists to kind of bridge the gap between programming and platform. DevOps is a really important role, specifically in big businesses. And I think we can mirror it on the UI by having what I kind of cheesily call DevOps, design operations. As a front-end architect, you can sort of iron out so many creases in the design process by understanding and being like design operations for your UI team. The UI team could be anyone. It could be all the way from UX designers through to software engineers who work on sort of middleware. So what we do is we assist relationships. We actually make sure we keep a lot of people happy. We can take feedback from the business, interpret that with a kind of a mind about the design process. We don't need to think about design itself. And we can start building scalable, reusable toolkits to service the client very quickly, make sure that it's consistent and robust for the developers, and also make sure it's nice and snappy for users. So what we can do is we can carve a bit of a path across every single role in the business and work to keep these people happy. And there are lots of people. I have to read this specifically from my machine, but I won't read them all because that would just be boring. But yeah, software engineers. If anybody's worked in a company that's very software engineering heavy, you will find that they will touch your CSS and they will break it and they will damage it. And that's because they shouldn't have to do that. I don't touch any database stuff because it's not my job. It would be dangerous if I started trying to write database schema. It's kind of understood or expected that everyone should contribute to CSS, and I don't think there should be. We need to keep people out of it and make sure they can interface with it safely. So software engineers, they shouldn't have to ask you to help build a dashboard. They shouldn't have to ask for help building a feature. You should be able to provide them with API-like CSS or toolkits where they can build it themselves. We're enabling software engineers to do stuff. UI engineers, other front-end developers, these are the most closely aligned to the front-end architect. We need to give them frameworks and tools. We need to provide them with solid naming conventions and things that they can scale the platform with. It's very important that we keep UI engineers happy because that's pretty much just one step away from what we are. Product designers. I understand the design process very well, but I cannot design to save my life. I can't make anything look nice. So what I do is I need to make sure that whatever the designers come up with is represented well. We build it and do it justice. But we also need to be educators. We need to teach designers how to design appropriately, how to design for performance. It's not really appropriate to just design something and expect that a front-end developer will build it. It's quite irresponsible. A front-end architect would say that, okay, I can see what you're going for here. It looks really nice, but unfortunately, it's going to render really slowly on these low-powered devices. We need to go back to the drawing board. UX is an interesting one. If you've got a dedicated UX team, you'll probably find that as a front-end architect, your principles are really closely aligned with those of UX. Both teams want consistency. UX designers want consistency across the UI, whereas front-end architects want consistency in the actual code we're writing. Also performance. I worked with a company in the Netherlands last year, and they had a real communication problem. They didn't really speak to each other. It turns out the UX designers had written a manifesto about performance being a key feature. They didn't share that with their designers, so it never got through to their developers, which meant the developers thought that nobody else cared about performance. And just by putting these two teams in touch with each other, the front-end developers and the UX designers, they suddenly realized that both teams value performance as the most important thing for that product. So yeah, UX designers, they're a really important group of people to be happy. We're actually missing out the most important people, the business, the person funding the project, and the user. We need to make sure that whatever the business is paying for is the best we can deliver. We need to make sure that we provide a robust and scalable platform. We need to make sure that what we're building isn't going to break every other day. We need to make sure that whatever we're writing is business appropriate. And the user, of course, if there wasn't a user, there wouldn't be a website. Give them performant, fast UIs. Give them consistent, learnable UIs. The user is probably the most important person in this entire sort of table. All this really to say that a front-end architect's job looks a little bit like this. We spin a lot of plates, keeping a lot of people happy, but I personally really enjoy that. It allows me to get a really good understanding about the problems and needs of my colleagues. Empathy is a very overused word at the moment, but it gives you empathy. It lets you understand what other business problems need to be solved, and you can help solve them. I mentioned the design process. Now, you do not have to be a designer to be a good front-end architect. You have to understand the design process. The kind of analogy I like to use here is IKEA. So IKEA have designers who will spend months and months and months designing one chair. They'll do ergonomic testing. They'll do things like they'll work out what the best, most renewable materials are, what's easy to put together, what's easy to maintain, what's cheap to buy. And they just hammer out that chair a million times over. So good design is actually very closely linked to the manufacturing process. So for a sort of front-end architect, understand that you will not influence how a project actually looks, but look for efficiencies in the process of getting there. Allow your designers to spend a lot of time designing the perfect button, but then find efficiencies just by recycling it. Forbid people from creating unique, bespoke, one-off design treatments. We shouldn't have anything unique in a project. Everything should be designed to be recycled. That's where IKEA gets its economies of scale from. That's where UI developers should get their economies of scale from. Enablers is a really, really important thing. So much like DevOps, we enable other developers to work more effectively. We solve their problems so they can service their users. Interesting point is that as a front-end architect, your user isn't normally the same as the site user. If we imagine a typical sort of setup, the customer, people who pay the money, e-commerce site perhaps, the people who keep the site going. Now, front-end developers build for them. The front-end developer's user is the customer. As a front-end architect, our user is more likely to be the front-end developer. We ultimately service the customer. We ultimately build for them. Our immediate user is actually the front-end dev team. We enable them to do good work for the customer. Okay, some more specific things now, slightly less philosophical. I mentioned knowledge sharing. So if you become the front-end architect in your business, your startup, your company, if you adopt that role, you need to make sure you spread that knowledge across as many people as you can. There's no point designing nice systems and toolkits if you just keep it to yourself. Knowledge sharing can cover a lot of different things. Some examples would be, how easy is it to learn this thing? We need to make sure we answer these questions. How easy is it to learn how to use this framework? Maybe we choose an open source third-party framework because it's easy to learn. We might build a small internal library, but it needs to be easy to learn because we've got lots of different developers working on it. Perhaps we want designers and software engineers and front-end developers to all contribute in the same way. So this would be a really important thing to us. How easy is it for people to learn? More specifically, how easy is it to get new developers into the company? If you're a growing company, which thankfully most tech companies seem to be, you're going to be doing a lot of hiring. It's really ineffective, really inefficient to hire someone and then they have to spend 3 weeks learning the tools. It's really inefficient. If you design frameworks and tools that are inherently learnable, very rule-based, very simple to onboard new developers, it means you could probably get somebody trained up to contribute to a code base within the first few days. This is actually a massive business problem. The amount of developers who I will see start at big companies and then sit twiddling their thumbs for 2 weeks, it's a huge waste of money. A front-end architect can change that. You can design systems and tools, which mean you can set up a dev environment in a matter of minutes. You can have someone contribute to the code base that very same afternoon. A thing that you'll probably find a lot in agencies is this idea of parachuting into projects. I worked with an agency recently who they actually came up with this phrase. One of their key problems was they couldn't get developers to parachute into different projects. If you just come straight from the top down, land in the middle of a project you're not familiar with, how long does it take to work out where you are? How long does it take to work your way out of where you are? So they needed a consistent way of writing code across several different sites so that they could just put developers on projects and have them working immediately. So knowledge sharing, a front-end architect has to do a lot of stuff like technical writing. Now, weirdly, I really enjoy technical writing, so documentation is something that I enjoy doing. That's quite rare for a developer, I think. But you can do more fun stuff, hack days. So if you've got an agency you're working at, you might come up with a really good internal toolkit. Have a hack day and get people to build on it, get people to demonstrate it by building things with it. Internal workshops and presentations, these are really important for everybody in a business to do. When I worked at Sky, once a week, every Thursday morning, a different team from the company would get to do an internal presentation. So if it was me, I'd be doing things about UI toolkits, aluminium. The performance engineers might talk about how many servers they've managed to decommission by just performance savings. The financial department might tell us that we all get Christmas bonuses. So it's really, really handy to have that kind of internal sharing across every team in a company. And like I mentioned before, paired programming and shadowing, just by sitting with your developers, your colleagues, and seeing what they're struggling with. They're sharing knowledge with you. You can see their frustrations, see what takes some time. Perhaps you find out that SAS compiles really slowly, so you might need to move away from Ruby SAS to libSAS, for example. So these are really good ways of sharing knowledge and then getting it back out into the company. Okay, wow, we're 29 minutes in. I think it's the first time the word architecture has appeared in a talk about front-end architecture. Obviously, this is a massive part of the front-end architecture role. Architectures and design patterns have been around in software engineering since day zero. You've got paradigms and patterns like procedural versus object-oriented, functional programming, perhaps. Patterns like MVC, they came from software engineering. We're starting to port these ideas into UI development, specifically with CSS. Architectures and design patterns need to be project appropriate. You might have a project which is going to last for the next 5 years, right? A huge project. Picking the correct architecture and appropriate design patterns is going to be really important. If you're building a one-page marketing site just to advertise an event that'll be finished in 2 weeks' time, picking naming conventions and architectures is probably not very sensible. A thing I tend to see quite a lot is people will build really small sites using really complex React, sort of front-end application, single-page application kind of stuff. It's important for front-end architects to make sure things are built appropriately. It's really good to be critical of tools and not use something just because it's new and shiny. Actually think about the business objectives of the project, which means you can refine and reimagine existing things. You can mush things together that exist from other places. There was an article that went around the other day called Object-Oriented Benix. It was basically 3 or 5 different front-end architectures, all smushed into one. It's completely valid to do that kind of stuff. You'll solve different problems depending on what project you're working on. So knowledge of different approaches and different architectures is vital to pick the correct solution. Example questions, do components need to exist on other sites? So if you're working on a project where you deploy a component into the ether, right? You build a widget that needs to exist on any site on the web. You'll need to think about encapsulation, safeguarding things. You'll need to reduce as many dependencies as you can. These are important questions to ask right at the beginning. You can ask these questions before you even know what a design might look like. These are important sort of architectural decisions that need to be dealt with very early on. Lots of developers contributing to the same code base. If you imagine somewhere like Facebook that might have 1,000 software engineers, if that's an environment you find yourself working in, then naming conventions are going to be really useful. Doing things like safeguarding regressions are going to be really useful. If you work in a small agency with 5 of you, then it might not be as important. You need to prioritize different things. Another interesting one, a lot of the clients I tend to work with integrate things back into legacy. You might have a site that's 6 years old. It's going to be very dangerous to rip that down and start again. So you might do a gradual rollout of new UI components. So knowing if something is going to fit into a legacy project is really important. That will completely change the way you approach building something. Example architectures, object-oriented CSS. Anyone heard of object-oriented CSS? Object-oriented CSS is just a paradigm that strongly promotes reuse. The example that Nicole Sullivan, who invented object-oriented CSS, the example or analogy she uses is treat every bit of code like a piece of Lego, and you should be able to stick it to any other piece of Lego in any order and get a different outcome. What this does is it really promotes the idea of reuse, which makes it really good for performance. You're recycling a lot of CSS, which means you don't have to write as much new stuff, which means file sizes are nice and small. But it does then give inherent dependencies. If you need 5 different objects to make one outcome, then you've got a dependency on 5 different things. But if you need heavy reuse, then use object-oriented CSS. BEM, block element modifier. Who's heard of BEM? So block element modifier it was invented by Yandex, who's a Russian search engine. It's a bit like Russian Google, I imagine. I think it's probably the best way to describe them. Really clever bunch of developers came up with this BEM, block element modifier. Block element modifier is a framework, or sort of an architectural principle, I guess, which promotes complete encapsulation. So it means that every single component in that project can exist anywhere. You can just deploy it on any site and it will work. It has 0 dependencies. Everything's completely encapsulated. IT CSS, you probably won't have heard of this one because this is one I invented and I haven't written up yet. IT CSS, the inverted triangle CSS, promotes scalability. So when I was working at Sky, the project, I was working at Sky for 3 years. I only ever worked on 2 different projects. So that's how long these things last. When you work in a product company, somewhere like Facebook, like Twitter, working in the government, for example, scalability is going to be really important. You need to make sure that whatever you start building today will still be usable in 2 years' time. It's really expensive to throw websites away, so make sure they can scale. But there's no reason you couldn't use a mixture of all of these. Perhaps you might need to encapsulate some things to put out on other websites. You want to reuse as much as you can because it just makes sense, and obviously you want things to scale. So you could make amalgamations of all these kind of things. So it's really important for front-end architects to have a broad knowledge of different methodologies.
When you're talking about scale, what kind of scale do you intend? Is it like more like the durability of the project, or?
So scale is a mixture of several different types of things. So longevity, how long will it last? So scalability might be a case of we need it to last for 5 years. So you might build in things like you might use microservices. So instead of using a monolith, you might peg little bits together. So that if in 5 years' time React isn't a thing anymore, you can just unplug React and plug something else in. So scale might be the amount of time. Scale might be the sheer size of things. So if you imagine how Twitter started off, it was a real primitive, real simple, post a message, someone can see it. Twitter's grown and grown and grown over many years to have different features. Yeah, it can embed video and GIFs and everything now. There's all this different type of stuff. So new features, how easily can we add new features on? Are we building something that we can start with a solid baseline and easily add new things on? So instead of creating an architecture that's very sort of top heavy, you create an architecture that's got a very solid baseline that you can peg things onto. And you might be scaling the company and the team. So you might end up with, or you might start with a site where there are just 3 developers. It's really easy to just turn around and ask somebody a question then. Oh yeah, how do I use this? Or you do that. When you've got 3,000 developers who work across different time zones, you're actually scaling the size of the company. So you might need to think about automated regression testing to make sure you don't undo somebody else's work. You might think about naming conventions. How do we actually name things so that these 3,000 other developers can understand them?
So it's more of raising the buzz factor of your project.
Yeah. So basically making sure that you can drop people out quite easily and replace them with new people. Yeah, if you imagine someone like Facebook, they must have hired so many different developers and lots of different developers that it probably isn't even the same company anymore. It sounds really obvious when I say it out loud, but that metaphor of if you take a ship apart and put it together again, it's still the same ship. It's kind of the same thing with a company. So yeah, you make sure you can get rid of people, or people can leave, not get rid. People might leave, other people might join. That's a scale issue. So scale issue might be about, well, for a software engineer, scale would be, can we serve 10 million people instead of 10,000 people? For front-end dev, it could be scaling a company, scaling the actual size of the code base sensibly, not contributing loads of wasted stuff to it. So yeah, scale is a very philosophical thing, I think, in terms of architecture. Hit upon naming conventions. I'm going to speed this up. Hit upon naming conventions real quick then. So BEM, block element modifier, the methodology, talks about encapsulation, meaning you can put your buttons on any other website, you can put your nav on any other website. BEM style naming is the naming convention that comes along with it. Something about to blow up. So yeah, BEM style naming is a naming convention that tells developers how to actually write classes. So BEM style naming, BEM, block element modifier, divides every CSS class into one of three categories. We've got the block, which is the self-contained root of a component. That could be a button, carousel, or a nav. You have an element, which is a part of that component, a part of the block. So it might be an icon inside a button. It might be a drop-down inside a nav. So an element is something that contributes to that component as a whole. And finally, we've got a modifier, which is a variation of that block. So you might have a button that's large, or a button that's small, or a button that's full width. These sound like fairly innocuous differences, but actually how you write those classes can affect how much you can learn about the code or reuse it. So as an example, like a metaphor, a person is a fairly self-contained block, right? A person's a thing, self-contained. A person's head makes that person as a whole. If you took a head off of a person, then the person doesn't really exist anymore because they probably died. So head is required to make a person. So what we do there is we write the class person head as person underscore underscore head. As in, we've gone down and in, and head is now an element of person. Then I have tall. So you might have a tall person to signify that that's a different variation, a different style, a different modification of a person. We use two hyphens. Now here it doesn't look like it's doing much, and actually, yeah, BEM's most used to us, its most use to developers in HTML. So it tells us how our classes actually relate to one another. If we just take a quick look at this, imagine you're new to a project and somebody asks you to just remove the user styling, and you open the HTML and you see all these classes. If we want to get rid of the user styling, well, obviously we'd get rid of this one. That one's kind of obvious. Are there any other classes there we should delete? Are any other classes there related to the user kind of UI of this component? Right now, without a naming convention, we have no way of telling. But if we were to use BEM, it would look like this. We can see that, okay, we've got user. It's specifically a style of user that is a pro user. Maybe they paid extra money to have the pro account. The user has a photo associated with them. So that photo is specifically to do with the user. Turns out the avatar isn't to do with the user at all. And then the person's got a biography. So the user bio. So the two underscores tells us that somewhere up the DOM tree, we will find user. Where this would become really useful is if you imagine Amazon.com has got a massive mega nav. It's got like a huge navigation with like loads of nested lists. That might be a huge several hundred line bit of HTML. You do right click and inspect element. If you see nav underscore underscore item, that BEM naming tells me that, okay, this is an item and somewhere further up I will find nav, and that's where this component stops. So it tells you a lot about the context that you're currently working in. It's really ugly, but that's kind of the idea. The good thing about BEM naming is that when you're scrolling through a site, you can spot things really quickly. And it tells us, yeah, that that's all the user styling. We delete those classes. The media object has these classes, so we just delete those if we need to get rid of the media stuff. The media object, if you actually Google the media object, that's what invented object-oriented CSS. It was invented at Facebook by a woman called Nicole Sullivan. And finally, we can see the avatar is just an orphan. It's not part of any BEM sort of scope. Cool. IT CSS namespacing is something that's part of my inverted triangle architecture. BEM tells us how classes work in a relative sense, how do they relate to each other. IT CSS namespacing tells us how the classes work at a project level. So it tells us things like, can I reuse this class? Is this class safe to be recycled? If I copy and paste that class somewhere else, is that what I'm supposed to do? Can I change this class, or can I change the styling on this class? Show of hands, who's ever worked on a site where you've changed some CSS in one place and it's broken something completely unrelated? It's almost like that's what CSS was designed to do. Having a knowledge of what we can and can't change is really useful. It helps prevent regressions. And will changing this do that thing? Will it break something somewhere else? So what we do is we can now begin to augment our BEM naming with letters in front of classes. So the media object is very reusable. The media object is simply a design pattern. It's structural. It's like a skeleton. So we give it an, this is where my accent really does me a disservice, O hyphen, only sounds like O hyphen object would tell us, okay, this is really recyclable. Feel free to use this anywhere. C hyphen component name tells us that this is a specific component. It's only really used here, therefore any changes you make will be quite safe. You'll see all the changes reflected here immediately. Utility, so we don't have classes which are just hide something, get something out of the DOM, to do u-hidden. It's got one job, very specific purpose, it's a utility class, and it can be reused anywhere at all. Then finally, if we're binding JavaScript onto the DOM, we do it with a JS class, so that we can delete a JS class and not delete styling, and vice versa. So we might have something that looks like this. This bit of HTML, we can see that we've got a box object. I know this is really reusable. I can drop the box object anywhere I like. It just boxes something off. It's not tied to a specific feature. You can see we've got a promotional component. It's specifically a component. It looks like this all the time. That's exactly what it is. It should be reusable, but it would never change its appearance. We've got a title using BEM again that lives inside the promo, and then we've got a utility that makes an H1 look like an H4, simple utility class. And then we've got a button component. That C tells me that if you change the button, you will see the changes immediately here. It won't go and break every button on the site because every button shares the same kind of root component styling. And yeah, finally, this JS class tells me that maybe if we click the button, it will have a little loading spinner while the website's doing some work. So yeah, very expressive and meaningful, gives us very rich naming. These are things that front-end architects have to come up with or employ on site so that developers can contribute safely, so that developers can read things, know exactly what they mean, where they can be used. So it's the job of a front-end architect to come up with this kind of convention. Okay, right, really start speeding up. Distribution and deployment. So we've gone through all this work to come up with these paradigms, these architectures, these design patterns. We've built these UI toolkits and frameworks. We've got kind of internal workshops going on. But that's no use unless we can actually get this to developers quickly and effectively. So we need to start looking at distribution and deployment. So how do we get this CSS toolkit, this UI toolkit, how do we get on a developer's machine? How do we make sure that every developer is using the same version of that UI toolkit? This is a very, very common problem in anything kind of software related at all. But as a front-end architect, you might want to version your buttons separately to your nav. So instead of having something like Bootstrap 4, you might have tabs 2.8 alongside grid system 1.9. So independently versioning them like microservices might be an option you need to take for the project you're working on. So once we've versioned it, how do we get those updates out to people safely? How do we upgrade everyone from grid 1.8 to grid 2.0? So we need to have a knowledge of front-end tooling. I imagine, well, who's used either NPM or Bower before? Yeah, most of us. I mean, I tend to use whatever toolchain my client uses. So I haven't used Bower that much, but NPM and Bower are really easy ways of just getting code onto dev environments, making sure that developers are using dependencies properly. This is a thing that a front-end architect would have to worry about. You might need to set up different repositories for different Bower versioned components. This is something I did quite a lot of with a client recently. They wanted a UI microservice library setting up. So we had loads of different GitHub repositories, each with a Git endpoint, so you could do Bower install tabs, Bower install nav, Bower install buttons. Just a good way of making sure that developers can use this work effectively. Then obviously once the developers have used it, how do the users use it? How do we package this up for users? How do we scrunch all the code into one file? How do we actually deploy it? How do we get it onto a server? There's no point going to all that sort of effort of building all these nice tools and then emailing a zip file to someone who's got the FTP password. It just seems really archaic. So who's ever used Gulp or Grunt? Of course, so Gulp or Grunt are just JavaScript task runners that might build fallback PNG images if SVG isn't supported. Or they might do things like concatenating all your JavaScript together and minifying it, that kind of stuff. So front-end architect needs a good knowledge of front-end tooling. The first, I admit that my knowledge of front-end tooling isn't as good as it should be, because I tend to work with different clients who have different setups. So I don't have a preference for NPM or Bower. I don't have a preference for Gulp or Grunt. That's something you end up experimenting with and finding out for yourselves. But distributing and deploying this stuff to other developers and users it's basically the last job you have. You basically need to make sure that, right, my work's done. As long as a software engineer can use my buttons and a user can use the site, actually your work isn't done, that's really irresponsible. But basically that's the lion's share of your work. Last thing I'd like to hit upon then is performance. So who's got even just a vague passing interest in web performance? That's amazing, that's good. So So yeah, performance I find absolutely fascinating. Performance is an actual business metric. There's a quote from KISS Metrics. A 1 second delay in page response can lead to a 7% reduction in conversions. Now this is a few years old, this quote, so I haven't really found anything newer. That means if your site makes $1 million a year, a page that's just a second slower could lose you $70,000 just for a second. $70,000 could employ a person for a year, and a second could affect that conversion. 7% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about it in those kind of terms, you could hire another person if your site was 1 second faster, or you could have a better Christmas party. There's a real life example I've got in a couple of slides' time, but as a front-end architect, setting performance budgets, speaking to clients and telling them that, okay, look, you can have these features, but just so you know, after we've gone over 300 kilobytes on the homepage, we're not adding anything more. You might need to set very kind of draconian rules for clients and other developers. It could be performance budget in terms of it has to load within 2 seconds. It could be, it can't be more than this many kilobytes. Performance budgets are really important. As a front-end architect, you'd probably do a lot of performance audits, seeing is this site fast enough? Where could it be faster? What's slowing it down? You'd set up monitoring and graphing, so you might use tools to actually plot different changes in performance. You might deploy a new feature. Then your automated testing might tell you that, okay, well, after that feature was launched, this site slowed down by about half a second on average. And this allows you to get involved in product and feature decisions. It's all well and good writing fast code, but if someone wants to add 8 carousels to the homepage, doesn't matter how good a developer you are, you cannot make that faster. So it's your job as a front-end architect to steer product decisions. I mentioned the financial thing. Here's a real-life example. I won't read the URL out, but if you can spot it, you'll be able to look at this site. Australian company got in touch with me. Really, really nice guy. He was like a non-technical founder. He said, look, Harry, I've got a site built, and it just feels really slow. I don't know why it's slow. It just feels really slow to me. Could you do an audit, a performance audit, and tell me what's slowing it down? So I ran a performance audit across this site, and I found that the homepage with 14.2 megabytes, it had 400 and something requests fired off. So it went off with 400 and some assets, and it took 64 seconds to load completely. And the thing is, the homepage of this site, I am not kidding, I promise you I'm not kidding, the homepage of this site was 2 logos, 5 images, and 6 links. Whoever had set up the front-end architecture stuff, the CDNs, were bouncing several requests. So basically they've got like wildcard redirects on their site, which then double the amount of requests for everything. Now, 14 megabytes for the homepage, this site was getting about 1 million uniques a month. Just think about the cost of the hosting and bandwidth that they were paying. Right? An irresponsible developer has cost that company so much money. As a front-end architect, even as a responsible front-end developer, you're playing with a lot of money there. You've got 1 million uniques a month, each one unnecessarily downloading 14.2 megabytes per homepage visit. Oh, and caching wasn't set up very well, because they got an F for caching of static content. So every time, it doesn't even matter how many uniques you've got, every time you hit the homepage, it's costing that company tens and thousands of dollars to host this site per month. That was the work of an irresponsible developer. So performance is key to keeping business owners happy. You can use tools like Web Page Test. Web Page Test is my preferred tool because it's free and it's distributed, so you can actually run performance tests from all around the world. Your server might be based right here in Ghent, but you might have a lot of users in Singapore. So you can run a performance test via Singapore, via a certain browser, and get grading off the back of it. Don't worry about getting any of these URLs written down, because I'm going to share the slides. Using Chrome itself, this was the site. This was the actual site I was on about in Chrome. And you see here, we've actually still got stuff coming over the wire after 2.7 minutes. You can't actually see the bottom of it, but it says here like 400 and some requests. But yeah, it's just absolutely 301. All these are redirects. All these 301s are basically saying, yep, keep going, it's moved. So bouncing around redirects unnecessarily. I mean, I really felt sorry for this guy. He was a real nice dude, but somebody just sold him a bad website, and that's irresponsible, and it's a front-end architect's job to not let that happen. And yeah, rendering performance. Have you ever used a site on your phone and just thought, oh, this is like treacle. It's just sluggish and horrible. Using Chrome's performance Audits, you can actually measure scrolling performance. Anybody used this before? This stuff's fascinating. You can literally measure how fast the browser can paint your page. You can find bottlenecks in, you might be using a lot of box shadows. Probably won't be with flat design, but you've got a client who loves drop shadows. That will slow your page down, and this will tell you exactly where. Okay, so just going a couple of minutes over. All of this stuff has been a very philosophical talk. We've had a couple of examples of things. Getting there, if this is something you want to get into, if this is an area of development you want to sort of start doing, it's actually relatively easy because you just start now, start reading things, break things. That's really fun. Go to like a well-known website, Google or Gmail or Facebook, and pick it apart, break things. They solve engineering problems on a scale that is just next level. So finding out what they're doing by breaking stuff and tinkering with it, looking through anything that's been open sourced. If you really want to get into it, it's quite useful to work in larger environments. Very keen to point out that I do not think there's anything wrong at all with agencies. I worked in agencies for 3-4 years before I worked a product. But it wasn't until I worked in a larger in-house environment that I really understood the importance of front-end architecture. With an agency, you will still do good work, but you'll do good work for like 2 months, 2 months, 2 months. When you're in charge of making a site last for 5 years, you have to be your own best friend. So learning about scalability, learning that you're not going to hate yourself in 6 months by just hacking something because you are kind of being lazy. Working in big environments is really, really useful. If you can get an internship somewhere big or a job, proper job somewhere big, just any way of getting in somewhere big, even if it's only just to decide that you don't actually like it. It's the most formative things that happened in my career. I didn't really know working in-house was an option until I moved to Skype, and that's where I picked up most of the stuff about performance and architecture. Cool. Here are some links for further reading. Again, don't worry about scribbling these down because I'll give you a link to the slides. Disclaimer, 3 of those URLs are mine. On this side, fairly philosophical kind of approaches to front-end development. And on the right-hand side, just the tools. Web page test. Web page test is tons of fun. Just to put like competitors' sites in, or your friend's portfolio, or anything like that, just to see, all right, we could speed that site up by doing this. It's really valuable insights. You could take that to your boss and say, hey, I did some performance audits over the weekend. I've realized that by using a CDN, we can do this, which should save us this much money over the course of the year. And that makes you a really valuable developer from a business point of view. Cool, well, I'm sweating a lot, so I'm going to say thank you for listening. I'll leave this slide up as long as I can. There is a link to the slides. If you want to grab a copy of the slides for yourselves, there they are. If you want to ask me any questions, well, not any questions, let's keep it professional. But if you've got any questions about career stuff or whatever, I'm more than happy to help out. Fire me an email. But thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Are there still unanswered questions?
Yeah, I think questions if anybody has them.
A few of us here in the room are working on a startup or at a startup. Obviously, you're working for big companies, but what of which of those tips or suggestions that you've given us could be implemented quite easily inside of a startup where, let's put context, where you are with 1 or 2 or 3 developers who basically are doing the whole application and not just the front end or just the back end?
Yeah, so startups are really fascinating because a lot of things are prone to change as well, I imagine.
Yeah.
So you might be, okay, things have changed. This product is a competitor. We need to change direction. So for any kind of startup, I would always go for microservices over monoliths typically, so you can pick things out. So instead of using one giant monolithic library, just all your decisions architecturally should be around, okay, well, that's not useful anymore. We'll just get rid of this a little bit. If you're expecting a lot, well, so if you're a startup, you need to work fast, right? So there's no point over-engineering anything. So work as quickly as you need to. But yeah, if you can keep things like, so you can unpick them, that can be really useful. If you're going to expect new developers coming on board, maybe opt for tools that are fairly well known to start with. You'll get the money in the long run to go back and do it all properly, but in the first instance, get things in front of users. Maybe work a little hackier than perhaps you normally would in a big environment. But as long as you can change direction. So every architectural decision would be, let's not use jQuery for all the stuff. Let's just use this little library for validation. We'll use this little library for animations. Instead of using Bootstrap for all the UI, you might use a little package from material design for something. And so yeah, architectural decisions in startups. I've worked with a few startups, and normally I just tell them, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Try and keep quite nimble, and the decisions around the tools you make, you should be able to undo those decisions quite easily. Once you get to being sort of Sky's size, the chance of ripping down a site and starting again are very, very slim. But that's when you end up getting more monolithic stuff. So that's when you could settle down and say, okay, no, actually, for the last 2 years, this naming convention worked really well. Let's formalize it and let's use it from here on in. Is that any use?
Yeah, sure. It's the way you describe it is also very important to change stuff fast and not over-engineer.
Yeah, exactly.
But sometimes you end up doing hacky things, and then
hacky things happen. Hacky things happen. I think another good thing to do in a startup is have regular tech debt days, or like sprints of just, look, we could keep on adding features, but really we need to start paying back this debt. So we'll have a sprint of just tidying up. So you might have like 3 months of just really intense product and feature work. Then you might have just 2 weeks of, okay, we need to actually port that from this library onto this one because that one's not getting looked after anymore or whatever. So yeah, being able to react and move fast, I guess, is the key. Any other questions?
No?
No?
Okay. Well, thank you, Harry, for talking through the amazing lessons. For the people who still want to stay a bit, the kind people of Digital Kent offered us some networking opportunities in the Comet, which is the room next door. We have some pastries ready for you, some coffee, some water. For the people sweating here, especially Harry, you might need some things to bring back the energy. So feel free to go to the Comet and have some networking with our students. Feel free to talk to them about projects they're working on. We have 7 different projects, from linked data to making semantic websites and so forth. So go ahead. Thank
I can find it. Honestly, I don't eat rice people. Yeah, I should go to but I'll make sure I grab something if I need it.
Well, it's a very good sandwich place.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, well, I need to work what time I need to leave. So I need to be around 6 p.m. Okay. So that's fine.
You need to go to Glasgow.
Yeah, so I get from here to no, I'm just going to try and
and right here. If you go that way, this bus stop and all the buses there up there go directly
yeah, I mean, it's only 1 o'clock now.
Thank you very much. Above my expectations.
Oh, that's good. Well, yeah, I didn't know if it was going to. I was going to send you on Saturday, so I don't know if you want to.
It's right. You show
That's fun. That's fun.
Oh, right. Yeah, let's get you some.
Yeah,
It will be a bit colder in the Comet, so let's go there. Quite